Well, hey everyone, guys and gals, and everybody else. We're live at Boomer TV. Today is the 51st anniversary of, or at least this month, this year, I should say, is the 51st anniversary of the most bizarre murder crime spree to unfold in the fanciest upscale enclave of Los Angeles. Hi, everyone. I'm Andy Asher. I'm editor over here at bloomerboomer.com. And it's a fascinating story, the one that has interested me for years and years and years because grew up in Los Angeles and I remember it all. And I was still, to this day, live in amazement. But on our show today is with the American-based foreign correspondent Ivor Davis, who delivered a gripping, I was there, eyewitness account about the notorious murder spree of Charles Manson and his gang. Now, today we focus on Manson's arrest for destroying government property, found hiding under a sink in a ranch in a California desert. Now, if you like this, by the way, I really would like it if you would follow us on your favorite social media. You can hear more about what's coming up and check out our website where you can see what's going on there. And this is a reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder. And it is none other than Ivor Davis. And Ivor, hey, it's always such a treat to have you here and hear your stories. Thanks again, as always.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's always a delight to talk to you, the man of many conversations, put it by that.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about. But I want to tell you, it's been really fun talking with you over the past couple of years, and I guess for the folks who maybe aren't as familiar with your work, I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about how you seem to be in at the right place at the right time for some pretty amazing stories. Can you just take a moment to just talk about that?
Of course. Well, I was very lucky. I was a young journalist in Southern California, born in England, moved to California, looking for a job, and then I was hired by the foreign editor of a London newspaper called the London Daily Express, which was a huge newspaper in those days with a 4.5 million readership a day, and we had a terrific foreign staff. And there I was, West Coast foreign correspondent in the early 60s. One of my first big jobs, which I'm sure I think I told you about last time, was joining a group of rock and rollers from Liverpool. I've forgotten their name, but I think you can probably, I'll remember it by the time our conversation finishes. And so this Liverpool group I traveled with, and then I was off and running, but I was, in the right place at the right time. And then you can fast forward. I mean, I was covering all these great stories, the political stories, traveling with political candidates, traveling with Senator Robert Kennedy in 1968. With him, unfortunately, at the Ambassador Hotel. And I walked into the pantry of the Ambassador Hotel, and there was Bobby Kennedy bleeding on the floor in a terrible tragedy that, of course, he was killed by Sirhan. And I happened to be there at the right time. Or at the right time. What wasn't really the right time, it was the wrong time, of course. And I just went from one big story to another big story. And in 1969, as you noted, I happened to be in Los Angeles when I went over to a a private residence in Beverly Hills, off a canyon in Beverly Hills. And it turned out to be the home of Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski, her husband, the famous film director. And of course, as the world knows, and as you know, there were 5 dead in the Sharon Tate house, 2 more murdered 24 hours later. And then fast forward, if you like, to November of 1969. And as you mentioned at the beginning of the program, Andy, the cops, the highway patrol arrested this grubby man hiding under a sink in a ranch in the middle of the California desert. And the guy that sheepishly crawled out from the under the sink was none other than Charles Manson. Now, as you and the world know, they didn't know that Manson was the key suspect and the ringleader of the killers of Sharon Tate and her friends. They arrested him, as you pointed out at the beginning of this broadcast, for damaging a piece of government property. And of course, he was carted off to a jail in Inyo County, California, to face this serious damaging government property, a serious problem. And of course, during the period that he was in jail in Inyo County, California, for those charges, one of his underlings, a lady called Susan Atkins, sang the terrible story of Sharon Tate's murder, because Susan Atkins was there, to a cellmate in the Civil Brand prison, and she named Charles Manson, and Manson was in jail at the time. And then, of course, as the world knows, LAPD went up, collected Charles Manson. He didn't have to plead guilty to damaging government property, but he was brought down and was the central figure, as the world knows, to this awful murder trial, which resulted in Manson and his devotees, his girls, being convicted of first-degree murder for the murder of Sharon Tate, and Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, who were an innocent couple in Los Angeles. And of course, he was convicted and went to prison and never, ever left prison. And he died about 3 years ago, never repentant, always claiming, I didn't kill no one. So that's the sort of nutshell of this horrendous story.
Yeah, and that's the other part of it. Aside from the seriousness and the awful and everything involved in that part of it, but what's been so fascinating are some of these little details that crop up over time that you just get into this whole story, and new revelations about one thing or another come up, and that's another reason why it's been so fascinating to follow this. And it's your kind of I was there account of the true story that brings chills to my spine and amazement, that anyone could hatch such a bizarre murderous plot, and then of course for those too young to remember, give us a recap of the murder spree and they unleashed around the hills of Bel Air, and the most expensive homes found there, anywhere. And I know, again, that's a long story and you touched upon it a little bit, but even that whole part of it is bewildering to understand.
Well, not only is it bewildering, I mean, very briefly, what happened was Manson had brainwashed his family, and his family were mostly runaway young women, a few men, and they lived on a rather disheveled sort of cesspit of a movie ranch called the Spahn Movie Ranch, which was in its heyday the location for many famous westerns. But Manson and his girls were living there. They were supposed to help keep the horses and the ranch clean for a very old geezer called George Spahn, and George Spahn owned the Spahn Movie Ranch. And that's where they hatched the murder plot, because in August of 1969, Manson sent the girls out. The girls were Susan Atkins, Leslie Van Houten, and Patricia Krenwinkel, to murder. And of course, as you pointed out, they went to this high-rent district in Beverly Hills. And Manson didn't really know that Sharon Tate, the famous movie star, the actress, wife of Roman Polanski, was living there. In fact, he just sent them because they knew where the location was, because Manson had been there with his friend Terry Melcher, who was Doris Day's son, and he knew of the location, and he sent them out, the girls out, with Charles Tex Watson, who was a young, handsome athlete from Texas who'd fallen into heavy drugs and was a disciple of Manson. And that's where they created the first macabre series of murders. And then after they murdered everybody, Manson thought they messed up. So the next day, the following day, August the 10th, 1969, Manson went in the car with them and drove around LA randomly until he finally came to a neighborhood in Los Feliz, which is about 15 miles from the first murder scene. And he knew the place because he parted with a guy from UCLA in the next door house. And I can't tell you how bizarrely random this second murder was. And poor Rosemary and Lino LaBianca, an innocent couple who just come back from a weekend boat trip, suddenly saw this little runt of a man in their house late at night. He said, "I won't harm you." He tied them up. He went back to the car. He sent Charles Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, his girls, into the house and said, "You know what to do." And they murdered the LaBiancas. And the strange thing, I mean, can you believe this? After he sent them to murder, Manson left the murder scene and he drove around to Santa Monica Beach and went for a walk on the beach with his girlfriend at the time, Linda Kasabian. And he said to the killers, "I tell you what, you guys hitchhike back to the ranch." I mean, that is something you wouldn't make up, but it happened.
Yeah.
And so as a result, just going full circle, Manson was accidentally discovered to be the killer when Susan Atkins, one of the killers, as I said, bragged to her roommates at the ladies' jail in downtown LA and boasted that she had murdered Sharon Tate. And as a result of her boastful confession to her cellmates, Manson was arrested and faced murder charges. And I don't know if you want me to go into it, but I covered the murder trial, which lasted nearly a year, and it was an absolute circus. It was crazy. Manson misbehaved. It's an amazing thing. I think there's been some television depictions, helter skelter, of what happened, and there was a very good recent Epix television documentary series called Helter Skelter: The Manson Myth that aired a few months ago. So the case was riveting, was awful, and it's like a terrible car accident. You can't take your eyes off of it, even though it is pretty horrendous.
Yeah, and gosh, there's so many questions that come into my mind as you're talking here. But the other question I had was, what was his motivation? It had something to do with being in the music industry, although that's been kind of debunked. What have you been able to figure out on that one?
Well, here is my theory. Now, Manson wanted to be a rock and roll star, and he actually was auditioned by Terry Melcher, who was a successful producer of music, Terry Melcher being the only son of Doris Day, the actress. And apparently what happened was that Manson auditioned, Terry Melcher gave him some money, promised to give him a recording contract, and then ignored him. And Manson was very upset at that. Now, in my opinion, and it's a thesis that I believe is true, Manson was upset at Terry Melcher. But what happened about 10 days before the murder of Sharon Tate was this. A musician in Topanga Canyon called Gary Hinman owed Manson some money, and so Manson sent Charles Tex Watson, his lieutenant, to get the money from Gary Hinman. Gary Hinman pleaded that he didn't have the money. It was a drug deal gone bad. Manson wanted the money back. Hinman pleaded poverty. Charles Tex Watson, who went to the Hinman house on Topanga Canyon, started bashing him around and actually ended up, at the instruction of Manson, killing murderously, terribly torturing young Gary Hinman and leaving him dead. Now, what happened to Charles Tex Watson about a week before the Sharon Tate murders was this. Watson was arrested. No, sorry, change that. Bobby Beausoleil. Bobby Beausoleil was another acolyte of Charles Manson. Bobby Beausoleil was the one who actually killed Gary Hinman in Topanga Canyon on July the 27th, 1969, 2 weeks before the Sharon Tate murders. Bobby Beausoleil was arrested. He was on drugs. He was arrested by the police and charged with the murder of Gary Hinman. Bobby Beausoleil did not implicate Charles Manson. Whatever you can say about Charles Manson, he had some loyalty to his underlings, believe it or not. And so, in my opinion, here's what happened. Charles Manson set up the murders of Sharon Tate and the LaBiancas to try and throw the police off the track of Bobby Beausoleil, who was sitting in prison. And what Manson told his girls to do was to kind of leave signs in blood at the murder scenes, because that's what happened at the Gary Hinman murder scene. And in his warped reasoning, Manson thought the police will investigate the Sharon Tate murders, the LaBiancas murders, and they will see it's exactly the same modus operandi as the Gary Hinman murders. And then they would say, well, then we have the wrong guy for the Gary Hinman murders. And they would kick Bobby Beausoleil free. And that was why I think Manson set up the killings to look like they were done by the same Black Panthers or Black militants. That sounds somewhat complex, but I want to tell you this, Andy. When I covered the case from day one back in 1969, the district attorney at the time told me he agreed that was his thesis. But of course, when the trial began in July of 1970, Vincent Bugliosi, who was the chief deputy district attorney handling the prosecution, came out with a totally different motive for the murders. And the motive for the murders, as those who followed the case will attest and know, was, believe it or not, Manson's gang. Manson brainwashed his gang to believe that lyrics from the Beatles' White Album was the reason why. Well, the Beatles had sent him secret messages in the lyrics of the White Album, Helter Skelter, Piggy's Revolution, predicting a black-white revolution. And so with all that kind of melting pot of phooey and mishmash of ridiculous reasoning, the killings took place, and Manson said the Beatles were warning him that there was going to become a black-white revolution, and the blacks would kill the whites, but Manson and his gang will escape to the desert and hide out in an underground city until the smoke cleared. I mean, as I tell you this story, Andy, the more I tell it, the more outrageous it is. And I think it was outrageous.
Yeah, it is.
The idea of the Beatles inspiring bloodshed.
Yeah, and there's so much myth and folklore about this, and the one that has intrigued me and is that I had heard that actually Manson did not do any of the killing; it was all his underlings.
Well, of course. I mean, that was the point. That was why Manson always said, "I didn't kill no one." And you're right. Manson was never at the Sharon Tate house the night of the murders. Manson was at the LaBianca house. As I said, he went into the house, he tied up Rosemary and Lino, he left the premises, he left the scene, and left his underlings to do the murder. And so Manson was not implicated. I mean, I must tell you that Manson was implicated much later in the murder of Donald Shorty Shea, a stuntman who upset him when he came onto the ranch, and he tipped off the police about guns, and the police raided the ranch and arrested Manson and then released him 2 weeks later. But anyway, the point is that Manson never actually physically killed anyone. And that's why I think the district attorney used the Beatles made me do it conspiracy theory. He tried to prove that you are as guilty of murder, even if you don't wield a knife, because you conspired, you led the conspiracy. And the district attorney's thesis of this whole crazy Beatles conspiracy thing led to the conviction of everyone. So, as I always like to point out, the end result was what he wanted, no matter how crazy it was, and no matter the fact, as you just pointed out, Manson didn't actually physically kill anyone at the Tate house or at the La Bianca house.
So I could go on forever about this, but and when you bring up some of these names of the past, I just remember all that was going around, and this was one of those stories that was it seemed too fictionalized to be true. But again, and so for some of the people who may have not followed this quite as closely, or of course not the age to remember it that well, and I know there were a lot of culprits in all of this, but if you could just give us a little bit of an update, at least maybe to make it simple, are the ones of the people who are the players in all this who are still alive today?
Charles Manson died 3 years ago. Susan Atkins, who wielded the knife and killed the 8-month pregnant Sharon Tate, died of cancer a few years ago. Charles Tex Watson is still in jail. Leslie Van Houten is in jail. Patricia Krenwinkel is in jail. And I must tell you that every 4 years they come up for parole. In the last 12 years, the parole board has said, yes, give them parole. But each time, the governor of California has denied the request. So they are going to spend the rest of their lives in prison. Do they deserve to stay in prison? I don't know. There's been a lot of debate that Leslie Van Houten, the youngest member of the Manson family at the time, involved in the murders, was only 19. She was high on drugs. Should she be paroled? It's a perennial question. She's obviously a different person at 19 as she is now at 69, 70, whatever. I can't remember how old she is. I think we're all different to the way we were in our late teens. But does that reasoning, Andy, excuse you and allow you to be released on parole? I don't know. I don't want to go there, but whenever they come up for parole, Sharon Tate's sister appears and said they showed my sister no mercy, so why should we give them mercy and release them?
Yeah.
So that's the situation.
Yeah, that's certainly a big discussion. Of course, she wasn't a minor, which is a year or two distinction there. But I know that debate is going on a lot here in California. And I know you're not a psychologist, so I don't want to put you in a position that you're not comfortable with. But let me ask you, what was it about Manson that drew so many oddballs and misfits to follow him into such a dark world?
Well, don't forget this terrible story played out in the 60s. And in the 60s, there was LSD, there were plentiful drugs, there was the Vietnam War, there was a protest movement, there were young people who were unhappy. And Manson was a brilliant con man. He'd grown up as a young man in the prisons, jails, reform schools. And by the time he got to San Francisco in 1968, he knew his way around. He survived. He was a small guy. He survived in jail all his life. And when he got out, he saw free love and drugs and all these young women not knowing what to do with themselves all their life. And so basically what he did was he recruited them all. He recruited them all to his little, if you like, propaganda. And I must tell you that he would tell each of the girls, the runaway girls that found their way to him, he would tell them, I'm your father, I'm your lover, I know what's wrong with you. he would con his way into the hearts and minds of these young, unhappy women. I mean, Andy, it's happening today. Didn't I read about this story with a guy with a strange name who just got sent to prison? I think I forget his name. Like he's got a funny name like XVYW. You know the
Okay.
one I'm talking about? The one who just got sent to prison for 50 years
Okay,
for having.
yeah, yeah, okay. Well, yeah, no, the stories are so unique, but then there is also a common thread that runs through them, and it's so tragic, but it happens and it's continuing to.
Yeah, I mean, psychologically, if you brought the psychologist on and they know the story, they would give you the pure chemical, emotional
Mm-hmm.
reasoning. But Manson, I want to tell you, during the trial, the girls, even though they were up on charges for murder with a chance of being sent to the San Quentin gas chamber, they behaved only the way that Manson told them. Every day I'd go to court and they would do what he said. They would shave their heads and carve swastikas like he did. They would sing. They would turn their back on the judge if he told them to. And so this behavior during a year-long trial persuaded the jury that if Manson can have them behaving like loonies in a one-year trial, he certainly could tell them to go out and create murder and havoc and bloodshed. And so they convicted him. And so Manson was this con man who was kind of the right time. He was there for the right time, at the right place, at the right time.
Yeah.
So that was his specialty, his expertise.
Yeah.
And he loved publicity. I want to tell you, Andy, when he was in jail, he did all these interviews. He was never a rock star. He was a superstar on television. You could see Diane Sawyer and you could see Tom Brokaw showing up in prison for the opportunity to show what an entertaining monster Manson was. And he appeared live very often on primetime television. So he never became a rock star, but he certainly became a famous killer.
Yeah. I guess maybe there's some kind of a cult thing going on there too, which again, that's another psychological issue that
Yeah,
someone
I
could
mean,
have.
Andy, I remember I forget the name of the guy who was in Jonestown, wherever that
Oh
was,
yeah,
somewhere in
yeah,
South.
yeah, yeah. Uh-huh.
I mean, here is a guy in Jonestown. I've forgotten his name for the moment.
I know.
Who got hundreds, hundreds of disciples to swallow poisonous Kool-Aid and kill themselves. So the cult leader is a fascinating subject, and Manson, without a doubt, was a cult leader.
Yeah. Well, tell us about your book, and there's a new audio version of it.
Yes, my book is called Manson Exposed, a reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder. And it's my story of covering it from day one. The book is out, and there's an audio book, and you can go on to Amazon.com, or you can get my book or the audio book, I think, on www.ivordavisbooks.com. And it's a fascinating story. I've lived through it, and in a way I wish I hadn't, but bizarre as it is, it's been part of the fabric of my strange reportorial career.
Oh, it's been fascinating. I just love talking to you, Ivor. Thanks again. We've had a few of these discussions, and I'm fascinated by every one of them, and they're all up on bloomerboomer.com. And probably, if I haven't already, we'll make sure that they're all put it all together so someone can maybe binge watch. But Ivor, thanks again. It's been great.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope next time we talk, Andy, that I'll be able to talk about Happy Days Are Here Again, because I think we need a tonic, don't we?
Well, yeah, that's for sure. Well, the one is what was the name of the movie? The Hollywood movie.
Once Upon a
Yeah,
Time in
there you
Hollywood,
go. Yeah,
the one
yeah.
by Quentin Tarantino.
Yeah, so that brought a little bit of a happy ending to a terrible story, but we, for those who haven't seen it, I won't give it away, but wouldn't you say so?
Yes, I would think so. But don't forget, it was called Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and Andy, it's a fairy story.
Yes, yes.
Entertaining, but there you go. Without spoiling the ending, I
Yeah.
think most people have seen it. But anyway, we won't do that.
Yeah, no, no. Oh gosh. Well, as always, it's been great, and we'll find a reason to talk again, okay?
Thank you, Andy. Stay well and have a good day.
All right, you too. Well, thanks again for watching. Again, we have been speaking with Ivor Davis, author of Manson Exposed, a reporter's 50-year journey into madness and murder, and you can find more about that on Facebook, YouTube, here at bloomerboomer.com. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next show. Bye-bye.